This is the case in the docket on the Supreme Court. It's called Warhol versus Goldsmith.
Right.
And it's the story of a photo of Prince.
Yes.
So in 1981, Lynn Goldsmith, who was a famous kind of rock photographer, took a portrait of Prince in 1981. He was an up-and-coming star. He certainly had nowhere near the fame, but he was someone who people who paid attention to music, they knew about him. So she took this photograph of him. 3 years later, when Purple Rain is breaking, Vanity Fair wants to do a story about him. And they commissioned Andy Warhol to do a portrait of Prince to illustrate, well, to tell about what you think, illustrate, to kind of give him the Warholian treatment that he's according because he's becoming famous.
Exactly. Couldn't be said better.
So I'm not sure if it's Warhol or Vanity Fair. Somebody pays Lynn Goldsmith
Vanity Fair
$400
Vanity Fair
to use the photo.
That's right.
As a magazine editor, that's how this works.
Right.
You license photographs.
Right.
They give the photo then to Warhol.
Correct.
Warhol creates his image.
That's right.
Not unlike what he's done with Jackie Kennedy, Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, all down the line.
Right.
Fast forward many, many years to Prince's tragic death. Vanity Fair, again, wants to do a tribute issue about Prince. They go now to the Warhol Foundation, which controls the print, that the piece of art that Andy made in 1984.
Correct.
And they license it for over $10,000.
Correct.
Lynn Goldsmith says, you owe me money.
Right.
And those are the facts involving this case.
Right.
The case, of course, involves many, many, many other things.
Yes.
Why don't you begin with what you think this case is about?
So what this case is about is the key word is transformative. Okay, transformation, because under copyright law, there's something known as fair use. Okay, and one of the elements of fair use, there's certain things like education, parody. That's why if people are doing things on Saturday Night Live, they're not getting sued because a parody is considered a fair use. Okay. Another defense or another example of fair use is if something is so transformative, okay, that it basically takes the original and the new version is so different or so distinct for some reason that that's a defense, meaning that the person is allowed to do that. That's a defense against the original person who owns the original copyright.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happening here. That's what the Supreme Court of the United States is debating right now, is whether Warhol, when he basically Warholed Lynn Goldsmith's photo, whether that was transformative enough to basically give Warhol the right to do that, meaning that Lynn doesn't get to collect any money from what Warhol did.
Just going back to the original piece of work, he was paid.
I think that was pretty good.
I do too. She was paid.
Yes.
Right?
She was paid.
And in the oral arguments made before the court this week,
right,
her attorney has no problem with the act of what Warhol did. What the problem is, they see, is going forward being compensated for that use.
Yeah.
And they take it to its extreme, which is that if you take the Warhol viewpoint, which is that she's deserving of no more money,
right,
that copyright is thrown out the window.
Yes.
That people will be stealing books and movies and music all over the place, and the original creator will have no defense because the new creator will simply say, this is transformative.
Right.
Right.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said. And that's exactly it.
Yeah. So where do you fall on this? I have a guess where you might fall as a copyright lawyer.
Let's first talk about there's reports about all of the justices, how loose and light and fun this almost was, right? So Clarence Thomas actually declared that he was a Prince fan, and people were saying different things. So I found that very interesting. But what I think Lynn Goldsmith's argument is very, very strong and very, very powerful, right? That what her argument is that if you have a copyright and someone can transform it, okay, then you are diluting the copyright, and therefore all of the copyright holders in the world will suffer from that.
Right, because you're
okay?
the Supreme Court and you're making a ruling on this.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Now, one of the things you and I talked about so passionately yesterday was that when we have these cases in music, there's musicologists who come in and basically say, okay, this is the structure of the song and so on and so forth.
Right.
What's fascinating about this is that we have the justices, Supreme Court justices, basically trying to decide if the original photo and then the subsequent rendition by Warhol was enough to make it a transformative use.
Right.
Okay. And so here, ladies and gentlemen, right now is where I am going to quote probably the most famous Supreme Court justice of all time, Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, okay, who said, and I quote, "It would be a dangerous undertaking for persons trained only to the law to constitute themselves final judges of the worth of pictorial illustrations." End of quote.
That's an excellent quote, and I admire your legal research.
Thank you.
It is an argument that I believe only Justice Alito kept returning to
Yes.
in the oral testimony. He was very anxious about the judges being art critics.
Right.
And he kept asking about the inclusion of art critics and other people, experts, to kind of rule on this.
Right.
It's incredibly complicated. And, Lynn Goldsmith's attorney, whose name escapes me right now, Lisa, well, we can come back to that, said that she has no problem with this. She has no problem with this artwork hanging in a museum. She's not opposed to the notion of this kind of transformation. She
Correct.
just believes there should be some kind of compensation and recognition for this.
Correct.
And that if you don't do that, if you buy the Warhol Foundation's argument, all hell will break loose.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Yes, I do. I do. And also, again, I'm not an expert, but if you look at the original photo and you look at what Warhol did his thing, but is that transformative? In my mind, is it purely transformative? You look at Prince, you look at the rendition, and to me, there's really not that much of a difference, right? He did what he usually does. He squiggles some things. I'm not demeaning his talent because he's a brilliant artist, right? But I do not think that this is transformative at all. And I do think that the repercussions of it could be great if they find that it is, because then I think it's just going to open the floodgates.
Well, again, we don't want to redo the oral arguments here, but there are lots of discussions about what the factors are in determining this.
Right.
It could be transformative.
Right.
But if there is a decision that the purpose
Right.
was commercial,
Good point.
that she should be paid.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
I kind of split the baby here. I think it is transformative. I think it's classic Warhol.
Ooh,
I think it's
okay.
also indisputable that when Vanity Fair contracts Warhol to do a piece of art about Prince or anyone, the piece of art may not be secondary, but the fact that they are now being Warholized is
Right.
in fact a commentary on their fame and their position.
Right.
Right?
Right.
When Mikhail Gorbachev gets a Warhol portrait, that is a benediction of his fame and his position in the world.
Right.
This may be a ridiculous comparison, but when People magazine would put someone on the cover, that was a kind of like judgment on their fame.
Absolutely.
They were now worthy. That's what goes on when Warhol does this work. That's separate.
Right.
I do believe the work itself. I think it's transformative. I think when you look at those Mick Jagger or Marilyn portraits, there are commentaries on the culture. There are commentaries on how we consume the culture. So I disagree with you on that.
Okay,
one. On
good.
the other hand, I don't think that's going to be the sole reason that the floodgates could be thrown open regarding copyright.
So if you were Lynn, right, and then you saw this, you would be okay with it being transformative.
If I got paid for it?
Right. You're saying if you got paid for it.
Sure.
Okay.
I'd be flattered.
So the argument actually changes. If you get paid for it, then it's and if it's considered transformative, then you're okay with it. But if you don't get paid for it and it's considered transformative, then you're not okay with it.
Right. Remember, in 1984, she was paid.
Right.
And she didn't complain.
Well, okay, excuse me. She was paid $400, which I mean, when I saw that number, I was like, wow, that's not a lot of money.
It's
And
not.
that's a work for hire. You're selling your rights forever.
But that's separate. So
Yeah.
she was paid $400 for the use
Yeah.
of her photograph. Her photograph was taken by
Yeah.
Warhol and Warholized. It appeared in Vanity Fair, and that was the end of it.
Okay.
And she's like,
That's
okay,
right.
right?
That's right. It's
Now-
over.
Now, whatever it is, 20 odd years
Right,
later,
he dies.
$10,000.
Correct.
She's like,
All
you,
right.
you reused my photo. Let's say that if Prince had died, when
Right.
Prince did die, if Vanity Fair had gone to her for the original photograph, she'd say, "Pay me again."
Right.
So in this
Well,
case, she's saying,
no.
Yeah,
She
yes, they
can't
would.
say that
Yes,
because
they
it's a
can.
work for hire.
Yeah, but they couldn't say to her, "We used your photograph in 1984. We're going to use it again for free." They'd be like, "No,
I think they might have been able to.
well, but okay, but
All right.
you could be sued.
Okay.
That's debatable.
Okay.
That's not fair use.
All right.
What? Because you printed a page. Look, I know how this works. So
Okay.
you print a page from you kind of like do a little tear
Okay.
from the 1984 magazine and put that in
Well,
your new magazine. So you don't want
okay.
to pay Lynn Goldsmith $400. Come on.
Okay. All right.
We all know how that works.
I'll make your point a little. I'll make your argument for you a little better.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Warhol had a copyright
on what he created.
did.
Yes.
It was copywritten.
right.
So that is going to be very, very, are you ready? Transformative in the decision, in my opinion. Because then there's the argument of Lynn's making her argument of, well, it dilutes the value of the copyright. Okay. If I'm making the Hackett argument for Warhol, I'm going to say, wait a minute. If I send my copyright into the United States Copyright Office and the federal government gives me a copyright and I can't enforce it and I don't have any rights under it, well, what the hell are we doing here?
So you're saying both sides are making interesting arguments that they are
Fascinating.
They are supportive of copyright.
Yeah.
In the Warhol case, for the piece of art.
Yes.
And in her case, for the photograph.
Right. And the funny thing is, it wasn't really in the press. The fact that he has the copyrights, it's being like one sentence, right? It's not really being brought out. But think about that. Okay. Think about if you own the copyrights to the work you did. I think that lends a lot of credibility to the transformative argument.
There was a case last year. I'm going to try to remember all the facts. Jasper Johns, the famous American artist who had a big show in the Whitney last year. He's in his 90s. He lives in Connecticut. And much of his work is kind of like the aggregation of kind of found objects and things like that.
Right.
He was in his doctor's or dentist's office, and he saw a drawing that turns out was made by a young African man who was a student at a nearby prep school. He borrowed that piece of art and included it in a piece of art that he did,
Right.
which then sold for an enormous amount of money.
Right.
He made some kind of passing kind of small offer to the young man. This got out that he'd made some kind of like, it was for a nominal amount of money or some kind of acknowledgement. This got out and caused a huge stir. People were not arguing necessarily that Jasper Johns had violated copyright, but that he had taken advantage of this young man. I bring that up only as one of the things that hasn't come up in the testimony, as far as I can tell, is what if, I believe there are 16 of these
Yes.
prints.
Correct. Prince.
What if they start being sold?
Right.
Does Lynn Goldsmith deserve money?
Well, at this point, I don't think that's been determined. If they start being sold commercially, I don't think she does. If it's held that it's transformative, then it's a fair use. Okay. But if you're
So her
asking,
$400 is enough.
no, I think that she should get paid.
I do too.
I think she should get a royalty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise, then there's two arguments here. What's the value of the original copyright? Okay. That's held by, technically, it's held by Vanity Fair because they paid her the $400. Right?
No, it's still hers.
Okay.
It's still hers.
That's we'd have to look.
No,
into
I
that.
know that for a
Okay,
fact.
all right, okay.
Photographers
So-
own the rights. You get to license it, but you don't own it.
Okay, so she gets the rights.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I do believe that it's almost like no matter what happens, right, that she should be compensated because she was involved. It's almost like sampling of a song in music, right? That's the way sampling works. It's like, okay, I'm going to take your work. I'm going to get your permission. I'm going to use it in my new rendition, and I'm going to pay you in advance, and I'm going to pay you a royalty based on your original work.
I agree with you. I thought the Mr. Martinez, who was the lawyer for the Warhol Foundation,
It was very good.
See, I don't think he was. I'll tell you why.
Well, see, they were coming at him. They were coming at him. Yes.
The point that I thought
That's a good point.
was his weakest.
Yes.
Was when he was asked about what's transformative and what's not.
Right.
And he tried to make the point that when books are made into movies, that's not transformative.
Yeah.
That was a lame argument.
We agree on that.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was trying to do that, I think, by way of saying, because it's not transformative, that's why movie studios buy the rights for a book. That seemed to be the suggestion he was making.
Yeah.
You know, I would think if you asked Roman Polanski if Rosemary's Baby was just like the book, he might take issue with that idea. Right. I mean, I get what he's talking about.
Yeah.
But I think it ends up going back to the point you made earlier on, which is that do we want Amy Coney Barrett determining what's transformative, or John Roberts? I got a problem with that.
The interesting thing is, okay, that they all, just from reading the transcripts that we read, if you're asking me, they're all really into this.
Totally agree with you.
They want to make this decision.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. So it's, because it's art, and maybe it's cool, and maybe they're fans of Prince, and maybe this is going to be a historic decision.
And who thought,
you want your name attached to this?
Who thought we would hear the name Luther Campbell again in testimony?
Yes.
In fact, I had to so there was conversations about Luther Campbell and Two Live Crew, and a parody of Pretty Woman that they did, which I guess, became a court case.
Right.
There was also another Campbell, Campbell Soup, that was discussed.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting argument, the distinction between using an image of Prince that Warhol did and Warhol's use of the Campbell Soup cans in creating his art, and the distinction there. Well, I thought that, and I think to your point about the justices being into this, they knew their stuff.
Oh, yeah. No.
And they thought about it.
They do know their stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, that was apparent, but you could also feel like there's sort of fandom, at least I could, coming through a little bit, right? The other thing here, the difference between the Campbell Soup can and Prince is that with Prince, you have a name, image, and likeness.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's a little, the can is the can, and it's a can of soup. With Prince, it's actually, there's other rights that would attach based on his name, image, and likeness. So there are a ton of things going on here, and this is going to be huge.
It's a really, really interesting case, because I don't think either of us obviously are opposed to the idea of sampling or transformation.
Not at all.
I do think, though, that people need to be compensated. And again, you come from the music realm, where this goes on constantly. And I would argue it goes on more and more and more.
Oh, it does. Yeah, much more. Much more. And it's easier to do. And you don't have the same kind of issues, right? It's widely accepted. Okay, for all we know now, right? People could start doing this more and more. I mean, if I were a new artist and I wanted to make an impression, I would start taking photos just like Warhol did and doing my thing to them.
Okay, but here's a question that, again, the justices flicked at this, but didn't really get into this. Inescapable in this case, which is why we're talking about it, is that it's Andy Warhol.
Yes.
Right? If this was some street artist.
Yes.
Well, first of all, he probably couldn't afford, or she couldn't afford to have an attorney to be in front of the Supreme Court. But this would be treated differently, that there is a degree of kneeling before the art.
They weren't shy about that. They said that this man spent his entire life doing this, making this imprint, and that's what has a big influence on us.
And I am being told that he is a great artist.
Yes.
And have been told this since I was a young person.
Yes.
Who am I to say that this is not the case and that this is not transformative?
The other thing is...
That's where I had a problem with his attorney. His attorney was leaning on Warhol's fame to an enormous degree.
Yes.
And reputation.
Yes, which was a little surprising. And he pretty much got attacked for that.
Yes, he did.
Right? Okay, but the other thing that's going on here is that most people like Andy Warhol. right? He was really that artist. He was kind of like Picasso, right?
But he was famous too.
Right. So you see these Warhols and you say, okay, that's really interesting, right? I may not think it's like a Magritte or something like that, but it's certainly worthy of what he did and what he changed. And that was his whole thing. His entire mode of art was really based on transformation of images in a lot of respects.
I totally agree with you. I also think he would enjoy the idea that his art was being mediated and discussed,
of course,
in the Supreme Court.
Why not?
Because it's exactly the kind of place. It's the intersection of where he was.
Everyone will be famous for 15 minutes in the future,
right.
Okay? And not only do we see that on social media, we now have the justices of the United States Supreme Court being exposed to a whole new group of people that may not have even known about them before.
By the way, Lynn Goldsmith's attorney's name is Lisa Blatt. I don't know.
All right, Lisa.
I agree with you. I think it's fascinating. Betting man.
Yeah.
Where are they going to land?
Well, based on, I think that they're going to hold it's transformative. And they're going to say it was a fair use. Now, they could say it's transformative, a fair use, and give Lynn some money and kind of split it, right?
Well, yeah.
But they are leaning, if you're asking me, to saying that it's a transformative use.
Well, I think they are. I guess my question, I'm kind of ashamed to acknowledge this. I'm not sure exactly what they decide. I mean, Lynn Goldsmith doesn't have a problem with Andy Warhol taking her photograph and transforming it as long as she's paid.
Well,
so I guess at the end of the day,
who would?
I mean, you kind of
art is commerce.
Well, I'm curious why Vanity Fair. Maybe they filed an amici brief in this case, but they weren't involved here,
right?
I mean, it strikes me if somebody just threw her $5,000, this would have been over.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I think the potential of this selling and being sold. I think they were saying it could be a lot more than $5,000.
No. I'm talking about the use in the special issue about Prince's death,
right?
That triggered the sale.
Yes.
No. We're not talking about.
You're probably
the broader
right.
issue.
Maybe a little more.
Right. I mean, I know that Lisa Blatt also said she has no problem with this hanging museum, but what is looming over this is how this, when this gets sold.
The commercialism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know there was reference, because you and I were talking about this before we came onto the podcast. There was reference, we had discussed Warhol's use of photography and his use of other photographs. And in fact, there is a discussion in this case later on in the trial during the oral arguments that the photographs, I'm not sure if it's of Elvis or Jackie or Marilyn, but there was no more copyright on those photographs. He knew what he was doing.
Oh, yeah.
He knew
very smart.
that no one was going to come after him for using those photographs.
Right.
So I think that's super salient in this case.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
When he created his art, he used photographs that he knew were in the public domain.
Right.
In this particular instance in 1984, it was work for hire for Vanity Fair.
Right.
Right. And then I presume there was obviously some kind of conversation where he kept the rights to that art, and it ends up now with his foundation.
Right.
So in that instance, he thought, well, I don't care. They gave me the photograph, or we paid for this photograph. And perhaps there was no photograph of Prince that was not copywritten. Right. It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah, but good.
But really good.
It's a great case.
Yeah. I do believe that if they rule too far in his favor, that if I'm a young musician or photographer, you're copyright is
it will dilute the value, the overall value of copyrights across the board.
Yeah,
it will.
Fascinating.
Which is why they may not do it. Right? They may realize that and come back. They may come back to a compromised position of some kind.
Yeah. Because I don't know again, reading the law as best as I can understand it.
Yeah.
The transformational piece is only one of them. The other one was the purpose.
Right.
There was four factors they were referring to.
There's 4 factors. Right.
So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.